What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. The other day I found a fantastic deal on an incredible oldhammer model, and this week is going to get cleaned up and put back on the table. Not too long ago, I picked up a couple of army cases off of Facebook Marketplace for $100. The larger and older army case had some really great stuff inside, including partially started Eldar Harlequins and a super sweet Mordheim warband, and also a fantastic start for an older Warhammer Fantasy Woodelf army. After I began working on that army, I went to eBay to set up save searches for a few of the harder to find pieces that I wanted to fill out the army with. In particular, I wanted to pick up an Orion the Woodelf King in metal. There have been a few versions of this model, but I wanted to get the original metal version. It just looks really great, and I thought that it would keep the classic feel for the army. Now, while there have been quite a few that have gone up since then, they've all been pretty expensive. With save searches, however, you can be very specific with things like price, so I set the searches within a comfortable range and let it sit until I got an email letting me know that there was one available. Well, I finally got what I was after, and I picked up an all-original Orion that was at the reasonable price of $35. Now, comparatively, that's pretty good considering what they generally go for. Still kinda high for what it is, but I honestly can't complain. The model itself isn't in terrible condition. There are mold lines under the paint, but the paint isn't actually bad at all. There is some chipping here and there, which is to be expected from older models like this, but the colors aren't terrible, and I actually really like the choices that were made. The biggest issue, and probably the reason it was less expensive, it is the reason, is that the whole thing is being held together with what's either hot glue or some kind of gel super glue that behaves an awful lot like hot glue. It's kind of like a Stretch Armstrong. Either way, it's a bit of a mess, and all the parts are right on the edge of falling off completely. Nothing is actually being held together very well, and eventually it will break. Kind of fun to play with though. Here's the plan. I want to take the model apart, clean as much of the glue off as I can, get the paint stripped using a combination of acetone and rounds in my new sonic cleaner, then clean him up and get him put back together and on the table again. In order to do that, we're going to need to start by getting the model into a bath of acetone and start removing the paint. It's a relatively quick process, and the paint gets softened almost immediately, which is perfect for metal models. After a few minutes soaking, I'll take them out and put the pieces into a jar of isopropyl alcohol. That jar will go into a water bath in my new sonic cleaner. Vivor was kind enough to send me this sonic cleaner, and I've used it a couple of times now. It has some nice features on it, like displays for temperature and time, as well as a drain for the solution inside. That's great because emptying it is a lot easier than trying to carry it and dump out the soap, just spilling everywhere on the side of all the electronics. Not great. You can just put a hose on it and empty it into a container for proper disposal. Lately though, I have been opting for the jar of isopropyl because the waste is much lower. The sonic cleaner is filled with just regular water, so disposal is not an issue, and the isopropyl can be used over and over again. Now that the acetone has softened everything on the model, I can put all of the parts into the smaller jar of isopropyl and place that into the sonic cleaner. Set the timer for 20 minutes and make sure that the temperature doesn't go above 50 degrees Celsius. If anything happens, everything is contained in the sonic cleaner in water under a metal lid, so the risk of any kind of fire is much less and the model will get extremely clean. A huge thank you to Vivor for sending me their sonic cleaner, and if you are in the market for one, then I will have links in the description for this particular model. I've run the model for quite a while, and now we can take it out and begin the cleaning process. Using a toothbrush, I can get most of the paint scrubbed away. It's really soft, and a lot of it has already come away from the model. I didn't have to do a lot of work. Next up, I'll get out my Dremel and use the soft wire brush attachment to get into the deeper recesses for any of the hard to reach paint, as well as clean and polish the surface of the metal. While going around the model, I can see any of the mold lines that need to be sanded down. I use a combination of sanding sticks and scraping along the mold line with an X-Acto blade. Just like plastic, it will catch the mold line and scrape it away. The sanding stick smooths the surface, and I can finish that off with another round of the Dremel. Once it's polished, you can really see how smooth the areas are that were just gone over. So I know there won't be any massive issues with mold lines on the model after we're done. In order to make sure that the model stays together for the long term, I will need to pin some of the pieces together using paper clips. I use a small hand drill in the center of two pieces and go deep enough to get a good amount of a paper clip inside. That gets glued into place, and then the two pieces can be glued together. It's not much, but having that extra connection in each piece makes it much sturdier and way more likely to stay intact for a longer amount of time. No hot glue or gel needed. In fact, you really don't need a lot of glue to hold those two pieces together anymore, which is pretty nice, and it doesn't make a huge mess. While getting Orion close to paint, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do about the base. Normally, this is on a square base, and it did come with one, but it's kind of small for the size of this model, and I don't really like that. I also don't think it's exactly the same size as the Old World is now. Anyways, I want to play this in an Old World army, but I kind of also want to use it as a proxy in Spearhead, which has round bases. So what I decided to do is use a round base that can fit inside of a square base, a converter, so I can use it for both. I didn't know, but I just found out that Mini Wargaming is making a bunch of gaming aids, including movement trays and converters. So I picked up a few different useful things and pretty much solves the problem. The idea here will be to get Orion sitting up a little higher on some rocky formations that will be surrounded by grass and plants. The edge of the square base converter will get a coating of tiny rocks and grass as well, and that way the whole thing will blend in and look perfectly normal as a square based model. And you can just pull it out and swap however you want. For now, I can do the round base and at least have something to hold on to while I paint. Once the glue is dry, I can get started priming the model. I like to do several coats of primer over metal, just to give it a little thicker coat, still preserving all the details of course. But a couple of coats through the airbrush is sufficient and less likely to chip. At the end, he will also get a coat of varnish for extra protection. For color, I really want to bring back the original paint job. I like the colors that were on the model, even though it was a little thick. The bright green of the skin and orangey wood on the spear really stood out to me. In fact, the only real issue with that model was the construction. It made an otherwise well done paint job look less than stellar. Let's start by getting some base colors down, and that will act as undercoats to the main colors. I'm going to start with a dark purple. This will look nice below a skin tone and some of that lighter green that the original had. Next up, I'll get out some forest green and go from a more top-down position in order to pick up the details on his chest. This will cover most of the face and arms as well. I'll follow that up with a bright yellow-green from the top down, and we get a really stark transition in color. This can be smoothed out later on and will act as a guide for the highlights. To bring in a little warmth to the skin and use that purple undercoat a little more, I bring in some pink flesh tone. This gets shot from below, and I try to blend the purple and forest green together to get a nice gradient for the skin. This helps bring a little more life into that skin and less of an undead green monster, which I feel is a good mix of what the original model looked like and what I would personally do. Still, there's a ton more work to do on the skin, but I want to get more of the base coats knocked out before starting on that detail. This is more of a roadmap for now. Using a dark brown, I want to set up a few areas on the model. The legs get a pass to start the brown fur, spear gets hit near the top and bottom, and I want the middle to stay brighter for some glazing later on. And the horns get a coat of brown as well, that should make painting them a lighter color a bit easier later on. Dark silver for all of the metallic parts. There are shin guards, wrist guards, and belts, and things like that, all originally silver. and we'll start there and we'll change things up a little later. The cloak gets a coat of forest green that I used earlier, keeping the color palette small and making the cloak feel more a part of his body. One of the things I liked the most from the original paint job was the loincloth. It was a vibrant red with some nice orange highlights in it, so I want to do something similar. I like to start with some dark red and get a nice base coat, and then we can work on the highlights. For the horns, I decided to go with a light khaki to start. This will cover nicely with a few thin coats and not get gummy like an ivory or off-white can over darker base coats. This will also work well for his teeth and fingernails. There is an awful lot of silver on this model, and that was how I got it. But taking a little bit of liberty with it, I want to add some Vallejo metal color gold. This will break up all of the silver, but the reason I want to use it specifically is that metal color gold has a really nice green tint to it, and it looks great with a lot of green around it. I mean, it pretty much always looks great, but I like how it pulls the colors together with models that are already leaning towards green. I really want to start getting some extra color into the skin. Going to use a couple of different colors to do that. I'll use a dark purple in the shadows to push those a little bit harder on the skin tone, and then come in with some light green that I use through the airbrush to highlight that skin with a regular brush. Then I'll use a touch of off-white to lighten up that light green just a little bit and layer over those areas closest to the top of the model and chest. So with just a couple of passes of color on the skin, the shadows get darker and the highlights get a little bit brighter. To continue pushing the metallics, I decided to use a metallic called Elven Armor from the Army Painter Air range. The thinned down air color over the metallic, while also being a metallic paint, will tint the silver towards the nice blue color, helping it look a lot more like the original painter intended. I set up the spear earlier with that darker brown on the ends. I filled in the middle with an orange brown that is a lot like the original, and I'm coming back in with thin glazes of the darker brown to blend the two colors together. It takes a minute, but it looks pretty nice too. For the horns and claws, I decided to give them a quick wash of soft shade. This will give them more of that bone color, and I can come back with a base coat and bring back the brightness. Then a little bit of back and forth with the darker wash to give the horns a little more detail. At this point, things are getting pretty close to being finished. The largest pieces left are the end of the spear and the cloak. The original had a really cool gradient from green to yellow on the tips of the spear, so I'm going to carefully airbrush the same colors onto those areas. A little dark green to start, which I'm also using on the basing material since it's already loaded in the airbrush, and that'll just help later on. And I'll follow that up with a yellow green from the middle to the tip. I also use this to alternate bright spots down each blade, giving it a more classic power sword vibe. I think this helps keep it looking like an older model while bringing the paint job into today a bit more. The last thing to do is get some grass on the base. I use some PVA to cover the flat surfaces of the cork that I use for the base, and covering the whole thing in a mixture of grass and rocks that I pre-made. It's a basic mixture of short static grass, a small amount of beach sand with some larger rocks in the mix as well. Static grass on its own looks pretty nice, but adding a bit of filler and you can just dip the model in and be done. A lot like Geek Gaming Scenics if you use their base ready mixes. I add a few tufts to the base and sprinkle some colored leaves around for contrast. I'm really glad that I found this model when I did. The Woodelf project has been on my mind for a while, and I've been wanting to work on it and get it ready for more games. I really want to do this army some justice for its previous owner. And if you haven't seen my first video about this army, then please go watch it and you'll get a better understanding of its importance. In the least, one of the coolest models in the army is taken care of, and I feel pretty good about the direction that the whole thing is headed. Hopefully I can find more pieces sooner than later, and we can get this army back on the table and taking down more old world armies. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you enjoyed something about this video, please consider hitting that like button, sharing this video with your hobby friends, and subscribing for more miniature rescues. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. And of course, here is the completed Orion the Woodelf King. Thanks again for watching.